Well, welcome to tonight's Provocations Public Lecture, co-hosted by the Royal Society of New South Wales and Charles Sturt University. My name is Michael Friend, Vice-Chancellor Research at Charles Sturt University, and I'll be your host this evening. But firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wiradjuri Nation in this virtual space. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all joining us from today. And I'd like to encourage you all to please share the nation you are joining us from today in the chat. I pay my respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to celebrate the rich cultural diversity of all First Nations people here with us this evening. Well, a very, very warm welcome to our online audience. We're really delighted to have you with us this evening. And please feel free to submit your questions at any time using Slido. You can access Slido either via the link available on the screen or by using the QR code displayed there. Now, Provocations is a series of public lectures, panel discussions, and blogs written by our prominent thinkers that aim to address some of the major intellectual and social challenges facing Australia and the world, fostering progress. Indeed, I would like to take this opportunity this evening to direct you to the Provocations blog, which can be found at provocations.csu.edu.au. Here you'll find a series of provocations designed to challenge orthodox thinking, written by provocateurs, each encouraging reasoned online engagement and debate. For each topic, we promote thoughtful online discussion and argument. Well, this evening's lecture will further strengthen our range of provocations. Tonight, distinguished Professor Geoff Gurr will address the topic, nature-based solutions for future farming. Professor Gurr is an ecologist with a PhD from Imperial College London. He spent over 30 years promoting nature-based solutions that integrate agriculture with the environment, securing in excess of 28 million in external research funding. He has held positions at leading Australian universities, including Charles Sturt, of course, and earned visiting professorships in New Zealand and China. And in particular in China, he received a 1,000 Talents Fellowship, which is extremely prestigious. With 44 PhD and Master of Philosophy completions to his name and over 450 publications, he is recognised amongst Stanford University's world top 2% of scientists. So it's a great privilege to have Geoff join us tonight. And we are very proud of the research that Geoff does at Charles Sturt and the impact that his research has both amongst our communities and globally. So without further ado, I give you Professor Geoff Gurr.
Well, thank you, Michael, for that kind introduction, and welcome to this evening's Provocations lecture, which will be a story in two parts. And I should warn you perhaps that the first part is a little bit dark, a little bit challenging, because I'll be setting out the nature of the challenges that we face for future farming. But please try and hang in there, because the second half will be a bit more uplifting, and I'll try to provide some really tangible evidence that we can rise to the challenges and create a sustainable future in relation to farming. Well, to get things underway, I thought we might play a little imagination game. And I'd like you to imagine that it's been a really hectic week and it's now Friday, in fact Friday evening, and it's time to breathe a sigh of relief, and you flop down on the sofa, the family around you, you flick on Netflix and are going to relax and enjoy a nice evening watching movies and having some pizza. So you call out for pizza and it arrives, delicious smell is wafting out the box, everyone's looking forward to it. You open the box though and you find something like this. You'd be pretty disappointed. You'd be feeling somewhat let down and anticipating the family might be not quite as full and satiated as they were hoping. Why am I telling you this slightly silly story? Well, the relevance is that in global agriculture, this tells us something about the nature of the challenge that we face. So various studies have been done, of course, about the impact of pests, whether they're aphids and caterpillars or rabbits and bird pests. But if you sum up the estimates and measured readings on how much yield loss occurs as a result of pest impact in agriculture, it's about 22%. Important to realise at this point is that that level of loss, about 1/5 loss, is despite our best efforts. This is not what would happen if we did nothing. This is despite all of our best efforts, modern technology, genetically modified crops, pesticides, which I'll talk a bit more about later, and other sorts of non-chemical options that we bring to bear. This is what's happening at the moment globally. Now that's a really big problem when you consider the broader context. Expert commentators on the future of agriculture at a global scale estimate that we need to approximately double levels of production above where we are today. That's partly reflecting increasing population growth, of course, but also reflecting the fact that we tend to have dietary preferences, including more dairy products and meat products. And so that means you've not only got to grow the food, but you've also got to grow extra food to feed to the livestock animals so you can get the animal products that you desire. Additionally, we're using a lot of land for growing fibre, cotton, various other fibre crops, and even biofuels these days. So there's a lot of pressure on the available space to try and grow more and more produce, including foods. And the challenge that we face in doubling production is that we're pretty close to the maximum capacity of the Earth's finite land space. In fact, you might be able to make out on the PowerPoint slide here that the amount of land that we're using for growing crops and grazing animals has shot up over the last 100 years or so, and there's very, very little scope for expansion. All the other good land is already used, mostly for our habitations, because we like to live in places that have got rainfall, pleasant climate and fertile soils. So we need to double production, but we can't expand productive area any further, and so we've got to grow more food per unit area. And that's why it's such a difficult thing to accept that pests are causing about 1/5 of our yields to be lost. Okay, so one might think, alrighty, let's just use more pesticides. Pesticides work, they're a mature technology, they've been around for ages. Surely we can just crank up the levels of usage and get rid of all these pesky pests. Well, the problem with that approach is that pesticides don't address the root cause of pest outbreaks. And I'll try to illustrate what I mean by an analogy. So imagine you've got a headache. It's quite okay to take some aspirin or some paracetamol to address that headache and give you pain relief. And you might perhaps take them for a few days. But if your headache persisted day after day and indeed week after week, I guess most of us would go and see a doctor and just check out what was the underlying cause of our headache. Is it something more sinister that needs to be investigated and treated? And the problem then is with pesticides, it's that we apply them to various sorts of crops to cure pest problems, but the pest problems have not come about because of a deficiency in the agricultural system of organophosphates or carbamates or synthetic pyrethroids. The pesticides are not topping up some natural deficiency in the system. So that's what I mean when I say that pesticides are not addressing the root cause, they're addressing the symptom of some deeper underlying issue with the farming system. So, kind of reflective of that overarching statement I've just made, we need to also consider that pesticides often don't work very well. And the graphic you can see on the slide there is showing just one of many studies that show that whilst pesticides can work, they're very far from being a panacea or a complete solution to pest problems. And a great deal of money can be spent by a farmer in an individual field spraying pesticides but getting no benefit. Pesticides are also hazardous to human health, and the graphic here shows some of the key statistics about lethal and non-lethal poisonings of people by pesticides. And this is a really big problem, particularly in the global south, where safety procedures for farm workers right the way through to food safety are not quite as mature as in more developed countries. And a small, somewhat trivial illustration of that is in China, where I've spent quite a lot of time myself living in recent years. It's utterly standard that in every kitchen you'd have a bottle of a particular type of detergent, and it's there to wash your fruits and vegetables before you chop them up and consume them, in the hope that it will rinse off any pesticides that are on the surface of those products. So pesticides are hazardous to human health, and society and individual consumers are very, very aware of this. A slightly less apparent and well-known fact about pesticides is that their efficacy is threatened by resistance in pest populations. I'll try to illustrate what I mean by this fact by pointing out the brown strip in the photograph you can see, which is a rice crop, and it was sprayed with an insecticide as a kind of a simple experiment or demonstration. So the brown patch with the rice looks as if it's been attacked by a flamethrower, was where the pesticide was applied. And far from the pesticide providing control of the target pests, it actually exacerbated their impact. It did that for two reasons. One is that the pesticide killed all the beneficial insects that might otherwise control the pests, but more fundamentally, because those pesticides or those types of pesticides have been repeatedly used year after year after year, the pests have evolved resistance to them. They can detoxify the toxins within the pesticide product, and so they can just tolerate the pesticide very readily. And that's why you see the brown strip there of very, very severely damaged rice. That is by no means an isolated incident. In fact, the graph here shows some key trends from global statistics about other sorts of pests becoming resistant to other types of pesticides. Suffice it to say that if we carry on with a business as usual model, then the efficacy of pesticides is going to decline markedly, even to the point where many of them completely fail to work anymore. Pesticides are also damaging to wildlife, and one of the more famous books in the field was called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It was called Silent Spring because she observed that in the woodlands of North America, where pesticide usage took off very rapidly in the 1960s, the woods were silent. There were no songbirds to be heard because of the adverse effects of pesticides flowing through the food chain and impacting the songbirds. Now, that book, Silent Spring, was published in 1962, and it became a very controversial but very influential book in terms of influencing public opinion and government policy and so on. And I think that most people would tend to assume that agriculture has kind of cleaned up its act, and that surely nowadays pesticide use is far less than it used to be back in the 60s, and surely everything's okay, isn't it? Well, unfortunately, if you look at these statistics, and we're looking here at importation and production of pesticides, for the reason that it's very, very hard to get accurate global statistics on actual usage, because it's a very granular phenomenon. You know, how much was applied to each of the millions of fields each year. It's hard to monitor that. But production and imports are much more regulated, and good data are available. And you can see then that since the 1960s, when that famous book appeared, the levels of pesticide-related activity have shot up quite dramatically. So, coming back to this question of surely the solutions for future agriculture rely in just using more insecticides, more pesticides. The twofold reason we can't do that are, first of all, they're not addressing the underlying causes of pest outbreaks. And secondly, if we do continue to use them, there are lots and lots of hazards that we need to be mindful of that can erode their efficacy and their social license. Despite those factors, it does rather seem as if many agricultural systems around the world are hooked, so to speak, on pesticide use. So, returning to this bigger picture challenge of how we can make food production, how we can increase food production on a finite land area, it could perhaps lead one to feel quite depressed about the outlook and wondering just what the pathway is to a more sustainable future for agriculture. So at this point, this is the inflection in the lecture this afternoon. Everything so far has been quite grim, certainly quite challenging, but I hope here's where we pivot, and I'll try and show you some of the solutions that my group at Charles Sturt University, working with international colleagues, the approaches that we're developing to try and provide a more sustainable pathway. But what I'd like to do is now play a second little imagination game, perhaps one that would be a little bit soothing to you after being assaulted by all those negative statistics and trends that I've just relayed to you. So, try to imagine a natural landscape. It doesn't matter where it is. It could be in the tropics, it could be in a temperate area, it could be a tropical rainforest or a woodland or some kind of grassland system. But in your mind's eye, just try to picture this landscape, and I'll ask you one question about what you're seeing. What is the dominant colour in your mind's eye at the moment? What colour is dominant in this natural landscape? Well, just possibly it's this colour here, green. And as your imagination perhaps crystallises a little bit and you see things a bit more clearly, you might start to make out some individual plants. And then perhaps some structures of plants like tree trunks. And as you zoom out in your mind's eye, you might see a landscape that looks a little bit like this, with multiple shades of this colour green. And indeed, if you were to really zoom out and take a kind of satellite view of the Earth's surface, it will be apparent to you that the land area is characterised by being green. And if you think about this, it's a fact that we take utterly for granted. We never stop to think about why it's green and how that greenness can be persisting so long over time and over such very large areas of the land. And that same mystery has occupied the minds of ecologists for quite some time. And It's sometimes referred to as the green world hypothesis. And the thinking behind this is essentially that, well, all this greenery that we see around us when we go to any natural area, well, that's plant tissue. It's salad, and better than salad, maybe really super nutritious plant materials. And it's just sitting there, right? Just sitting there, inviting a herbivore, maybe an antelope or a caterpillar or a beetle to munch away on it and consume it. And yet, somehow, season after season, over catchment to catchment, greenery persists. So, how is that so, given it's just sitting there waiting to be eaten? After all, plants can't uproot, literally, and flee when they're being approached by a herbivore. They've just got to sit there and take it. Well, in fact, the reasons for the world being so dominated by the colour green, reflective of plants growing almost everywhere where there's fertility and water, is twofold. And the first is that plants have really powerful friends to help them to persist and withstand the attacks of herbivores. And the second reason is that whilst plants might look really innocent, benign, perhaps even vulnerable, they're surprisingly well defended. And what I'll do over the next few slides is unpack those two very broad brush statements and try to illustrate them for you. And this will explain why the world remains green, and it just might be that we can borrow some of the lessons from the biology of these systems and apply them into our agricultural systems to make them more sustainable. So this leads us into the whole idea of trying to harness nature-based solutions for future farming. And the work that I'll be showing you in the next several slides has been done largely by my group at Charles Sturt Uni, but the point I want to reinforce here is that it's been a truly collaborative venture with partners all around the world, because the challenges that we're dealing with tonight are truly global. They affect all agricultural areas in every continent. And so there are teams around the world where my group has engaged, found a common interest in these nature-based solutions, and in some instances at least had a few wins. So let's dive into this. The first of those reasons that I asserted account for the fact the world remains green are that plants have powerful friends. And what I mean by that are things like the animals that you see pictured here. And the top one is a fairly familiar type of insect, a praying mantis, and you see one chomping away on a fly here. But the insect on the lower part of the screen is a much less familiar one. And I'm referring here to the wasp, which is caught in action here, and she is inserting her stinger, or ovipositor as it's more properly known, into this unfortunate weevil pest, and she's inserting the ovipositor through the pest's anus because it's so heavily armoured with its exoskeleton that the anus and the mouth are the only orifices through which she can insert her ovipositor. Very gruesome, but rather useful to us with an interest in controlling pests naturally, because the eggs of the wasp will then hatch inside the insect and eat away at the body contents of the host. And as they complete their feeding phase and mature, they'll then punch their way out through the exoskeleton of the weevil, emerge as a wasp, and then complete the life cycle again and again. So anybody out there listening who, like me, is a big fan of sci-fi movies and enjoys things like the Alien series, nature got to that sort of gruesome life cycle way before Hollywood thought about using it to speculate about how certain types of alien creatures from other planets might attack spacemen and deposit their eggs inside spacemen, only to have them mature as chest busters and then go forth to rampage through the space station or spaceship, causing mayhem. So this is very much a case of art following in the course of nature. So they're the powerful friends that I think are in part responsible for our green world. But the problem is that those powerful friends that plants in natural systems are reliant upon as bodyguards, if you like, they need food sources. So another example is this creature here. It's called a hoverfly, and this one here is taking pollen from a plant, and pollen's a very rich source of protein, without which these female insects can't mature their ovaries and produce eggs. And that's a shame, because they're very useful insects. Apart from the adults being very effective pollinators, the grubs or the larvae of this type of insect, which resemble a maggot, they crawl over plant surfaces and they'll consume various sorts of pests like aphids and small caterpillars very voraciously. They're extremely effective control agents for many pests. But in the absence of suitable plants from which they can obtain the pollen, then their population density will decline. And that's a really big problem if we start to focus away now from natural systems into agricultural systems. Because in agriculture, unlike nature, we tend to grow crops in a monoculture. It's just wall-to-wall rice plants or apples or cotton, whatever. We don't have very much in the way of other plant species growing there simultaneously. And indeed, if we did, we'd spray them with herbicides, weed killers to try and control them. And so that means that in a field setting like the one you see pictured here, there are zero opportunities for the types of insects that I've been talking about, the beneficial ones that control pests, to obtain these complementary foods that they require for their successful life cycle. So this now will transition into a brief account of how we can take this natural effect and change the farming system to make it rather more friendly towards these beneficial insects. So even a very modest, a very easy change to farming practices can make a big difference. For example, in rice fields, rather than having a monoculture, we could potentially grow a secondary crop, and this one here happens to be okra, or lady's fingers, which also provides nectar and pollen, the sorts of foods that beneficial insects require. You can grow that on the bund, on the earthen bank at the side of each rice field, and the farmer can harvest that as a secondary crop. But more importantly, from our perspective in controlling pests, it's providing shelter and foods that can attract and promote the activity of beneficial insects that then will control the pests that are trying to damage the crop. Now, you may be asking if what I'm talking about here is just a theory or tree hugger kind of greenwash, or if there's any hard evidence that it can actually work. So I'll just show you a few slides from a big experiment on Asian rice that I helped lead a number of years ago. This is probably the biggest experiment that I've ever been involved in. And we worked with farmer groups in China and in Thailand and Vietnam, and the local agricultural agencies and research groups to develop a system whereby locally appropriate crops were selected in a sort of farmer participatory co-design process. And those plants were then added to what would otherwise have been a monoculture of rice. And we are testing whether that made a difference to the activity of beneficial insects and maybe helped to check the outbreaks of pests. And in this study, there were 16 separate sites. The sites were in the ground for 4 years, and as I mentioned, this took place across 3 countries. So this was a seriously big experiment. And what we found was that having these plants that do produce flowers for much of the season attracted lots and lots of beneficial insects, and these had a big effect on the pests, such that they are more heavily parasitized by little wasps like the one you see pictured here on this slide. So we have an effect in relation to parasitism rates increasing, and as you might imagine, that translated over time into massive reductions in the numbers of pests in the crop itself. Now these trial sites that I've been describing were on commercial farms, and we asked the farmers to just take normal pest control action as they see fit from day to day. We didn't tell them you cannot spray, but of their own volition, through observing lower numbers of pests, on average the farmers sprayed only once per season on the sites where the flowering plants were being grown. And that was a massive reduction compared to more than 3 times per season on average for the control areas where just standard farming practice was used and the rice was grown as a monoculture with no flowering plants. In addition to all that, when we got to the end of each season and those crops were harvested and the yields were measured, there was a very significant increase in the grain yield of the rice crop itself. And so we're getting a really big advantage here. We're getting fewer pests and therefore less need to apply pesticides, so we're making cost savings. We're also getting a higher yield from our primary crop, and incidentally the farmers could then harvest the secondary crop, the ones that had produced flowers earlier in the season, and attain a dual income from those. In fact, when the economic modelling was done, it showed that for farmers who switched to this diversified system, including flowering plants, they had a 7.5% economic advantage over standard practice. And this piece of work was the easiest one that I've ever encountered in my many agricultural-related projects, the easiest one to then persuade farmers to implement, because word got out and the technology or the approach snowballed such that farmers from neighbouring areas were just taking this method and running with it with very little need for extension activity or communication activity to promote the idea. It's now being used by literally tens of thousands of growers across Asia, and in fact in China it's now recommended policy by Beijing, and the policy documents say to farmers this is the best way to grow rice, no longer as a monoculture but as a diversified system with flowering plants. Some follow-up work after that big experiment that I've just described was a European Union funded project called Legato, and it took a far wider view than the earlier project, wider than just benefits for pest control and economics, and it showed that in areas where groups of farmers started to adopt these more diversified and nature-based approaches for growing rice, they enjoyed the benefits from a number of additional ecosystem services, things like soil fertility increased, largely as a consequence of increased activity of detritivores. Detritivores is just a fancy name for the small animals that live in the soil, like earthworms and springtails, that break down crop residues at the end of the season and release the nutrients in the soil so the following crop, whether it's another rice crop or wheat or vegetables, they have lots of nutrients available for their growth. Regional pollinator assemblages were also increased, and of course whilst rice isn't an insect pollinated crop, many of the other crops that grow in these rice production areas are. insect pollinated, and so having increased densities of pollinators in the system was strongly beneficial. Wildlife conservation was also enhanced, as were aspects of cultural heritage and leisure, amenity value. So enough about that. Let's come back home. Let's talk about Australia and whether these methods that appear to have such promise in Asia can have a role here. Well, I'm happy to report that the situation is looking very, very favourable, in part because industries in Australia are very forward-looking and mindful that a business as usual model is probably not the best way to go to embrace sustainability and public licence. So my research group has enjoyed very significant funding over the years from organisations like Wine Australia, from Hort's Innovation, and from the Cotton Catchment Communities Cooperative Research Centre to take a closer look at those commodities that each of those organisations looks after, cotton, vegetables, vineyards, and to look at pest control and nature-based solutions more generally, and develop strategies that can be rolled out in Australia to make those industry sectors more sustainable. And we've enjoyed very significant levels of success. Okay, at this point I'd like to now move on and talk about the second of the major reasons why we have a green earth, why there's so much plant material out there not being consumed by pests. And this reason relates to plant defences. So plants are sessile, they're rooted to the spot quite literally. They cannot flee to escape pest pressure. They have to somehow counter it by other means. And probably the most familiar example of this type of phenomenon is the spines on a cactus. And you can imagine that a camel or a goat approaching a cactus like this one would find that somewhat challenging as lunch. But whilst that's a very familiar case of plant defences, most plants don't have those sorts of very conspicuous thorny spines. So how do they protect themselves from pests? Well, it's very much more than just about spines. And the graphics that you see beside the photograph of the cactus are something a little bit similar, but on a microscopic proportion. These structures, which look kind of like a science fiction landscape, are called glandular trichomes. They're tiny hairs, usually no more than 1 millimetre high, often much, much smaller than 1 millimetre. But the special thing about these glandular trichomes is that the head that you can perhaps make out on the tip of each of the spines. And the plant packs its own self-made insecticides into those tips, so that when an insect walks over the plant surface or tries to eat the plant, it ruptures the membrane that surrounds each of those globules and releases this compound with great precision, exactly when and exactly where necessary, to deter the activity of that attacking pest. And this very brief video clip that I'll show you here illustrates that effect with an aphid walking over the surface of a plant which has very dense trichomes. And as it's blundering its way across, it's bumping unavoidably into these trichomes, rupturing the head and becoming exposed to the contents, which are strongly irritant in nature, but moreover, when they are in contact with atmospheric oxygen, they'll oxidize and produce effectively a glue, which will then anchor that insect to the plant surface, even cover its mouth parts, and certainly arrest any feeding activity. So that's just one very nice example of how plants have, over the millions of years of attack by insects and other sorts of herbivores, evolved some really crafty defense mechanisms. The second strategy that I'll show you by which plants can defend themselves in ways that are not really obvious to us humans is even more amazing, because plants can also cry for help when they're being attacked. And this plant you can see on the slide here, you may be able to make out a caterpillar that's consuming a leaf, and the plant is able, within an hour, to turn on metabolic pathways that will generate volatile chemicals. And these chemicals will waft away from the plant. And the really cool thing about this mechanism is that the beneficial insects that I was speaking about earlier, including parasitic wasps, have evolved the capacity to detect these volatile chemicals, and they'll follow the odour stream upwind and find the plant, because they know they can associate that odour with a particular type of pest, and they'll know it's one that they need for their prey or for the hosts to parasitise and complete their life cycle. So those volatile chemicals I'm talking about are known by the slightly complex term herbivore-induced plant volatiles, HIPVs. But essentially, the plant using a chemical language, not the sort of language that we use, but a chemical language to cry for help and recruit bodyguards that can come and attack the pests that are feeding on them. And the wonderful way that we can exploit that natural phenomenon that happens, quite naturally in rainforests and grasslands and hedgerows naturally, we can make this work in our crop systems by some quite simple techniques. And one of them is by topping up the amount of silicon available to plants. Now, going back a generation or so, plant scientists would have poo-pooed the idea that plants need silicon, but in fact, many plants, including in crop systems, are deficient in silicon. And so if we can make this available in particular environmentally chemical formulations, plants can take this up in their roots. And the effect of it is that it amplifies this cry for help that I just described. It changes the blend of chemicals in the HIPVs, these chemical cues, and makes them even more attractive to beneficial insects. And we've shown this in a few different cases, including rice, and this particular study was a cucumber example, where we found that this very charismatic predator called a red and blue beetle was much more strongly attracted to pest-infested plants when the silicon fertilisation to those plants had previously been topped up. A second technique that we can use very practically in agriculture to exploit this chemical defence mechanism that I'm describing is to spray plants with synthetic versions of HIPVs. Now, these chemicals are naturally occurring, but fortunately for us, we can make them in the laboratory, and they're very inexpensive. And remarkably, those very same chemicals are also used extremely widely in the food and beverage industry to provide flavours for confectionery and so on. So they're extremely safe, both in terms of the environment and for the consumer. But the cool thing is that when you apply these synthetic HIPVs to a plant, it activates the plant's own chemistry and leads it to produce its own endogenous blend of HIPVs, and then send this out to attract beneficial insects. But as you can perhaps imagine, this capacity to turn that mechanism on by the application of a synthetic HIP gives us the capacity as a grower to respond to the early signs of a pest outbreak by spraying not a conventional synthetic and potentially harmful pesticide, but by spraying a synthetic HIPV and using this as a way to get the plant to turn on its natural defence mechanisms. And in the graphic you can see on the slide here, it just shows that for various types of synthetic HIP, the consequences of this can be a reduction in the numbers of caterpillar pests, in this case Heliothis moth caterpillars. It goes further in terms of the practical relevance of this method. And you can walk into the aisles of your favourite hardware store. I won't mention the name of the hardware chain, but it's one where you can famously get a sausage in bread on the way in. Or you can jump online to look for this product. It was developed by the company that worked with us on that earlier work that I spoke of using synthetic HIPVs. And they've commercialised this then in the form of something called eco oil. Their marketing department wasn't crazy about that rather complicated term that I mentioned before, HIPV, herbivore-induced plant volatiles. They thought, well, how can we sell this to the average consumer? So they turned it around a little bit and they use HIPPO, which stands for herbivore-induced plant protection odour. And the idea of this product, which contains synthetic HIPVs and a natural plant-based oil, is that you can spray it onto a crop, whether in your home garden or in a horticultural commercial context. Spray it onto your crop at the first signs of a pest outbreak, and it will recruit beneficial insects that will nip that infestation in the bud. So we come to the conclusion now of the lecture, and I just want to make a few points to reinforce the major theme of what I'm talking about here, which is despite the kind of quite grim and dark start of my lecture, one about optimism. Because if we think about the natural world being green and not being chomped away by numerous herbivores, it's because plants have amazing defence mechanisms, and those plants have also got powerful friends in the form of beneficial insects. And here's the great thing. We can exploit those phenomena to develop alternatives to hazardous pesticides. And in this brief lecture tonight, I've just had a chance to illustrate a couple of examples of how we're making extremely tangible headway in that challenge. And switching to these nature-based solutions really works. I showed you with that Asian rice example how we got fewer pests and higher yields. We lowered production costs and we increased profits, and so farmers were very happy with that. But moreover, if we consider the fact that farmers, whilst concerned about pests, that's far from the only problem on their radar screen. Farmers are busy people with many other imperatives or many other concerns. But the nice thing is that we can look to nature-based solutions and get additional benefits, things like increased pollinators, more nutrient cycling, and even conserving wildlife on farmlands. So essentially then, future farming has a number of major challenges before it, but I think that nature provides lots of ideas that we can harness and bring to bear to provide some effective solutions. So just in conclusion for tonight, I'd like to briefly acknowledge the many funding organisations that have supported the work of myself and my collaborators, and with a final plug that the work continues, and if you would like to be a part of that future work by joining us as a PhD scholar, then please contact me and discuss your potential eligibility for a domestic PhD scholarship. And on that note, thank you for your attention, and I think we may well have time for some questions. Back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Geoff. That was an exceptionally engaging presentation. We've got time for some questions. They're starting to come through on the Slido, but please, if you've got questions, send them through on Slido. So to start off, given the challenges, why do we see pesticides still so widely used, given the hazards?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question of why pesticides remain so widely used is a complex one, inevitably. It's partly because they are a solution to an extent to pest problems that is easy to patent and market. And these large companies that sell them have got very, very large marketing departments. So they're able to keep this potential solution very much in the sort of front of mind for growers as a solution. And I guess the second part of the jigsaw puzzle, or the only other part of the jigsaw puzzle I think I have time to address, is that unfortunately human beings like simple answers. And if we go to the doctors with a certain ailment, we want to walk out of there with a script for a medicine we can take and it's cured. We don't want to hear about lifestyle choices, changing our diet, getting exercises and giving up doing the things that we love, like consume red wine. So yeah, I think pesticides are responding to that human quirk of wanting a supposedly quick fix to a complex solution.
Thanks, Geoff. Yes, it is. It's a wicked problem, isn't it, that we do seem to be obsessed with quick fixes. So what do you see as some of the major constraints to the development and adoption of biological control alternatives or approaches?
Yeah, look, again, to try and provide a really brief answer to that rather complex question, there are three broad approaches to biological control. One is to look overseas where the pest originated from and import it into the country where the pest is running amok. And that has been stunningly successful in a very few cases. One reason it's not used more widely is because of the ecological risk of bringing in a pest that would be a case of the cure is worse than the original disease. And for us Aussies here in Australia, the cane toad is a famous example of that. And the cane toad is a far bigger problem than the cane beetles it was brought into control. So that importation approach has got risks. Secondly, the second major approach of biological control is to rear them up in massive laboratories. And I've seen some of these around the world, and some of them are incredibly extensive. You know, they produce millions of insects a week. The problem with that is it's costly. Typically, releasing biological control agents is about 10 times more expensive than spraying an insecticide. The third approach, however, is what I've devoted the last 20 years to, and it's saying effectively, let's make the very best possible use of the beneficial insects that are there already. Let's try and alter the farming system with some subtle tweaks to make it more benign to their survival, attract them into the crops, and let them control the pest in a system like that. And in fact, the products that I try to mention without it sounding like a commercial interlude in the presentation, that is quite widely used in fruit and nut trees commercially.
Great, thank you. So will the types of biological controls you've described potentially impact on other avian and mammalian species?
Yes, look, I think is the question there perhaps driving at when those vertebrate animals are the target pest. If that's the case, then I think the applicability of biological control to those animals is significant, but it carries higher risks because those animals, those target animals, are more closely related in taxonomic terms to our domestic animals, domesticated livestock animals, our pets, and also somewhat closer to human beings. So there's extra need for stringency in the specificity and safety testing there.
Thank you. And finally, what are the next crops or commodities that you plan to work on?
Well, I've got an ARC discovery application in the current round, and if that is announced as successful in October, we'll be working on wheat and tomatoes with Western Sydney University. And a relatively newly started project here at Charles Sturt University is working with sesame, which is an emerging industry in Australia. And we're quite optimistic about starting that industry without it carrying a kind of an inherent need to be sprayed all the time. We're trying to understand the biocontrol agents that might make it a crop we can grow with minimal pesticide inputs.
Great, thank you. Well, we have, I think, come to the end of our time this evening. So thanks very much, Geoff, for a very thought-provoking presentation and thoroughly enjoyable discussion. And thank you all for those online who have joined us tonight. And we hope you've enjoyed it and look forward to you joining us again at the next Provocations series with Professor Jane Quinn.